Verna Sowell was 74 years old the morning her two sons sat down at her kitchen table in Harlow Bend, Iowa, and divided her husband's life into shares. She wore the same oatmeal-colored cardigan she had worn to Earl's funeral 2 years before because it was the warmest thing she owned and because the furnace in that farmhouse had never once heated the kitchen properly in 51 years of marriage. She poured coffee for everybody. She set out the good cups, the ones with the little blue windmills, and nobody drank from them. And by the end of that spring, the parcel her sons handed her as a joke, the one they told her to be grateful for, the one she paid $3,450 of her own money to clear, would be worth more than the farm, the acreage, and the implement lot on the highway put together, and it would do something the money could not do. It would take a name that had been carried like a stain through that town for 63 years and set it back down clean. But she did not know any of that on the morning of the kitchen table. On the morning of the kitchen table, she knew only that her older son had brought a folder with tabs in it, and that her younger son would not look at her, and that both of them had already decided. Curtis was 51 that year. He sold crop insurance out of an office in Renner with his name on the glass, and he had a way of putting his hand flat on a piece of paper before he explained it, as if the paper might get up and leave. Neil was 46 and worked for a fertilizer company and lived in a subdivision with a fountain at the entrance, and Neil had always let Curtis do the talking, which was its own kind of position to take. Curtis's wife, Deirdre, sat at the end of the table with her purse in her lap like she was waiting on a bus. And Verna's granddaughter, Wren, who was 26 and had driven 3 hours from Dubuque without being asked to, stood behind her grandmother's chair with one hand on the chair back. Because there was no fifth chair and nobody had thought to bring one in from the porch. Curtis put his hand flat on the first page. He said that they had all been through a hard 2 years. He said that Earl had left things simple on purpose, everything to Verna, and that was fine. That was right, but simple was not the same as smart, and there was the matter of what happened next. He said that the farmhouse was too much house. He said the furnace was original, and the well pump was on borrowed time, and the stairs were a fall waiting to happen, and did she want to be the woman who fell on those stairs in February with nobody in the house? He said all of this in the voice of a man who had rehearsed it in the car. The proposal was this. The farmhouse and the 80 acres would go to Curtis because Curtis had the credit to carry the note and because his boy might farm someday. The implement lot on the highway, 3/4 of an acre with a metal building on it where Earl had sold and serviced grain augers for 38 years, would go to Neil, who had a buyer already, though he mentioned that afterward and quietly. Verna would move to Fairview Court in Renner, a one-bedroom on the ground floor with a pull cord in the bathroom, and the boys would split the rent between them, which Curtis said twice, as if the splitting were the gift. And Verna, so that it would be fair, so that nobody could ever say she had been left with nothing, would take the Mercer Street parcel. She had to think for a moment what the Mercer Street parcel even was. Then she remembered, and something went very still in her chest. 11 years earlier, Earl had gone down to the courthouse on a Tuesday in November and bid on a lot at the county's tax sale. It was in the middle of the block on Mercer Street, one street back from what used to be the business district. And it held the old Harlow Bend fire station, 2 stories of dark red brick put up in 1901, with a square hose tower on the north corner and 2 big arched apparatus doors facing the street, and every one of those openings bricked and boarded shut since the spring of 1965. Earl had bought it for the ground. His idea had been to knock the building down and gravel the lot and use it for overflow when the implement business ran out of room in the fall. He never did it. The demolition bid came back higher than he expected because of the brick and because of the tower, and then there was a good year and a bad year and another good year, and the building just stood there with weeds in the gutters, and the taxes came due every year, and Earl paid them the way a man pays for a mistake he has decided not to discuss. When he died, the last 3 years of them had not been paid. Curtis slid the tax statement across the table, $3,450 and some cents, to bring the parcel current and clear the county's lien on it. He said, "We can't carry that against the farm." He said it in a tone of great reasonableness. He said, "The parcel's yours, Mom, free and clear, and honestly, it's the only piece with any story to it. You always liked that old building." Neil laughed then. It was not a cruel laugh. That was the thing about Neil. He was never quite cruel enough to be answered. He said, "You can ring the bell on Sundays, Ma." Deirdre said the word liability twice in one sentence. And Wren, behind the chair, said, "That's not a share, that's a bill." And Curtis said her name in the way you say a name to close a door. Verna looked at the tax statement for a long time. She looked at the parcel number and the legal description, lots 11 and 12, block 4, original town of Harlow Bend, and a little abbreviation after it that meant improvements included. She thought about her checking account, which held $11,000 and some dollars, most of it from 31 years of substitute teaching, and the rest from selling Earl's good tools to a man from Ottumwa who had not haggled. She thought about the pull cord in the bathroom at Fairview Court. And she thought about her father. Everybody in Harlow Bend, over the age of 60, knew what her father was. Arden Pruitt had driven engine number 2 for the Harlow Bend Fire Company for 22 years, and on a Tuesday night in March of 1963, the Sheldrake Hotel on the corner of 3rd and Ottaway burned to the ground with 4 people inside it, and the town decided, in the way towns decide things, that the reason 4 people died was that the engine came late and the water never came at all, and that the man responsible for both of those things was the man at the wheel. There was an inquiry. The inquiry lasted 2 evenings. It produced a page and a half of findings, and the page and a half used the words delay in response and failure of apparatus, and it did not use anybody's name, which meant that the town got to fill the name in for itself and never had to be wrong. The fire company disbanded that summer. Arden Pruitt lived 8 more years in that town with his mail delivered and his coffee poured and nobody looking straight at him, and he died at 59 of a heart that had been quitting on him for a while. And Verna, who was 11 the night of the fire and 19 the day of the funeral, had spent every year since then being the daughter of the man who let the Sheldrake burn. She signed the papers. That is the part that Curtis told people afterward, and it was true. She signed the transfer of the farmhouse and the 80 acres, and she signed the transfer of the implement lot. And she wrote out a check for $3,450 and some cents to the Renner County treasurer, and her hand was steady doing it. And then Curtis pushed one more page across, a short one, and said it was housekeeping. It was a quitclaim. It said that Curtis Sowell and Neil Sowell, for value received, released to Verna Sowell any and all interest they held or might come to hold in the Mercer Street parcel, together with all improvements, fixtures, appurtenances, and chattels situated thereon. Both of them signed it without reading past the first line, because it was the piece they were giving away, and nobody reads the piece they are giving away. Wren drove her to the courthouse in Renner the following Monday. Verna could still drive perfectly well, but Wren had taken the week off and would not be argued with, and there is a certain comfort in being driven by someone who is on your side. The recorder's office was on the 2nd floor at the end of a hallway that smelled like floor wax and old radiators. And the woman behind the counter was Maribel Quist, who had been 3 years behind Verna at Harlow Bend High, and who still wore her reading glasses on a beaded chain. Maribel pulled the file. She pulled more than the file. She came back with a folder as thick as a hymnal and set it on the counter and said, "Well, Verna, you've got yourself something here." The parcel had a strange history, and Maribel walked her through it with a pencil. In 1901, the lots had not been sold to the town of Harlow Bend at all. They had been deeded to the Harlow Bend Fire Company Association, which was a private volunteer association of 31 men who had raised the money themselves with suppers and raffles and a subscription list that Maribel had a photostat of, and the building had gone up with association money, and the apparatus had been bought with association money. And every deed and bill of sale in that folder ran to the association and not to the town. The town paid the association a yearly sum for protection. That was the whole arrangement, and it was an ordinary arrangement for its time. When the company disbanded in 1965, the association did not sell the building. It could not agree to. Half the surviving members would not sit in the same room as the other half by then. The association simply stopped meeting, and its charter lapsed for failure to file, and the property sat there in the name of a dead organization with the doors bricked up and the taxes running. For 40-odd years, the county sent notices to an address that was the building itself, and the notices came back. And the amount grew until finally the parcel went into the tax sale where Earl Sowell had bid on it for the ground. And here was the piece Maribel put her pencil on. The deed conveyed the lots, the improvements, the fixtures, and the chattels. Not the real estate alone, everything on it. Whatever the association had owned and left inside those walls had never been sold, never been transferred, never been claimed by the town, and had ridden along with the title through every conveyance since, the way a chair rides along in a house nobody has opened. Maribel said, "Do you know what's in there?" Verna said, "I know what used to be in there." Maribel said, "Honey, nobody's opened those doors since I was in the 8th grade. The key was the other thing. There was no key." What there was, in a manila envelope stapled into the county's file, was a brass tag on a ring, and the ring held 2 long, flat keys of a kind that has not been cut anywhere in 50 years, and a note in pencil in somebody's dead handwriting that said side door, north, and under that, bay doors sealed by order. Verna and Wren drove back to Harlow Bend with the ring in Verna's coat pocket, and neither of them said very much. Mercer Street runs 3 blocks and then quits at the Grain Co. op fence. The station stood in the middle block with a vacant lot on one side where the barber's building had come down in the 90s and a low white insurance office on the other that had been 3 different things since. From across the street, it did not look shut so much as asleep with its arms folded. The brick was that hard dark red they made in Iowa before the war. Laid up in courses so tight you could not have got a dime in the joints, and there was a stone band above the arched doors with the year cut into it, 1901, and above that, in raised letters formed out of the brick itself so that no one could ever pry them off, the words Fire Company. The 2 apparatus arches had been filled with concrete block up to the spring line and covered over with plywood that had gone gray and soft. The hose tower rose square and blank on the north corner with a louvered vent at the top and a cast iron finial like a spear point, and under the finial, in a little open belfry that most people in that town had stopped seeing years ago, hung the bell. Verna stood on the sidewalk with the deed in a grocery sack because she had not brought a folder, and she looked up at that bell for a while. Her father had rung it. Not for fires. By his time, there was a siren by then on the water tower for fires. He rang it on the 4th of July and at the end of the parade, and once she remembered. On a February night, when the temperature went to 28 below, and the company wanted every house on Mercer to know that the station was warm and open and had coffee. She had been small enough to be carried in and set on the running board of a truck, and she remembered the smell of that building better than she remembered her own wedding, cold iron and hemp rope and floor oil and wet wool. The north side door was down a narrow way between the station and the insurance office, 3 steps up, a steel-clad door with a rim lock. The long flat key went in and stopped. Verna worked it, and it would not turn. She was still working it when a voice behind her said, "That lock's been sitting 60 years. Verna, it's not being stubborn. It's just full of nothing but rust. Ozzie Krall was 71 and had spent 34 years climbing poles for the Rural Electric before his knees retired him ahead of schedule, and he lived 2 doors down from the vacant lot in a bungalow with a flag on it, and he had been watching from his porch since she parked. He went home and came back with a can of penetrating oil, a rubber mallet, a pry bar, and a folding lawn chair, which he opened and made her sit in while he worked, which was the most gallant thing anyone had done for her in some while. It took him 40 minutes. He oiled the lock and tapped the cylinder and worked the key back and forth a 16th of a turn at a time and talked the whole while about how they built these doors to keep drunks out and not much else. And at 11 minutes after 2 in the afternoon, on a bright cold Monday in April, with a wind coming up Mercer Street off the fields and Wren filming on her phone from 3 steps back, the rim lock let go with a sound like a knuckle cracking, and the north door of the Harlow Bend fire station came open for the first time since the spring of 1965. What came out of it was air. That was the first thing, and Verna would talk about it for the rest of her life. It came out slow and heavy and cold, colder than the April day, and it carried the smell she had been carrying in her head since she was 11 years old. Cold iron and hemp rope and floor oil and wet wool, and under all of it, faint and sweet and unmistakable, the smell of neat's foot oil on leather. Wren said, "Grandma." Ozzie said nothing at all. Verna stood up out of the lawn chair without help, and she took the flashlight Wren handed her, and she went in. The doorway gave onto a short passage with a plank floor and a coat rail on the wall, and then the passage opened, and the beam of the flashlight went out into a space so much bigger than the light could handle that for a second it simply disappeared. The apparatus bay of that station was 62 feet deep and 30 feet wide, with a pressed tin ceiling 14 feet up and a brass sliding pole coming down through a round hole in that ceiling into a circle of worn plank floor, and it was not empty. It had never been empty. In the middle of the floor, facing the bricked-up doors it had been aimed at for 61 years, sat something long and low and enormous under a canvas tarpaulin, and where the canvas had sagged and slipped at the front corner, the flashlight found a curve of nickel-plated brass as thick as a man's arm, and a scrap of gold leaf, and the tip of one wooden spoked wheel. Ozzie went back out for his big lantern, the square one he used to take up poles, and when he set it on the plank floor and turned it up, the bay came out of the dark all at once, the way a photograph comes up in a tray. The canvas was not thrown over the machine. It had been laid over it. Somebody had taken the trouble to fold the corners under and to run a length of clothesline around the whole thing and tie it off at the front spring with a knot that Ozzie said was a trucker's hitch and that took him 4 seconds to undo and made him quiet for a minute afterward, because a man does not tie a load down like that on something he is walking away from. They pulled the canvas back from the front, the 3 of them, walking it toward the rear of the bay hand over hand, and 61 years of dust came off it in a slow gray curtain that hung in the lantern light and would not settle. And there it was. Engine number 2 of the Harlow Bend Fire Company was a 1928 Corbin Hale piston pumper rated at 750 gallons a minute, 24 feet long from the tip of its bumper to the tail step, and it had been painted a dark red so deep it went to brown at the edges of the lantern light, with gold leaf striping laid on by hand and a gold leaf numeral 2 inside A. Shield on each side of the hood, and across the back of the hose bed, in letters 6 inches tall, Harlow Bend Fire CO. The radiator shell was nickel over brass, and it had gone dull as a nickel found in a couch cushion, but it had not pitted, not one blister of green, because the building was dry and the doors were sealed, and nothing had breathed on that metal since Lyndon Johnson took the oath. There was a brass bell the size of a bucket mounted on a bracket ahead of the windshield. There was a searchlight on a swivel. The pump panel down the driver's side was a wall of gauges with white faces and black needles and little brass tags stamped suction and discharge and relief, and every needle sat at rest exactly where a needle sits when a pump has been drained and put away right. The wheels were wooden spoked with solid rubber tires, and the tires had flat spots on the bottom from 61 years of standing, and that was the only sad thing about it. That and the mouse damage in the seat leather where something had got in through a vent in 1970-something and lived a small life and died. The hose bed was loaded. That was what stopped Verna. Not the brass, not the gold leaf, the hose bed. 2,000 feet of cotton-jacketed 2.5-inch hose lay in that bed in flat folds with the couplings squared off at the tailboard ready to pay out, and a soft suction hose was strapped in its cradle along the running board, and a 24-foot extension ladder was in its brackets on the side with its bed section and fly section still tied off with a hank of cord. And there was a pike pole and a tube and a pair of rubber boots standing on the tail step with the tops folded down. The machine had not been retired. It had been put away wet, so to speak, and then left. It sat in that bay pointed at doors that had been filled with concrete block in full harness for the length of a human life. Ozzie sat down on the tail step and took his cap off. He said his Uncle Marv had been on that company. He said, I was 9 years old and they let me ring that bell on the 4th. He said, everybody in this town says the engine got sold to a collector in Illinois. That's what everybody says. That's what my own father told me. And Verna said, my father never said that. And Ozzie said, no, ma'am, your father wouldn't have. The rest of the bay came out of the dark piece by piece as Wren walked the lantern down it. Against the south wall, a run of 48-coat hooks with a boot rack under them, and hanging on those hooks, still 31 long canvas turnout coats gone stiff as barrel staves, each with a helmet on the peg above it and a pair of 3/4 boots collapsed underneath. And every coat with a name stenciled across the shoulders in white. Lance, Crawl, which made Ozzie put his cap back on and turn away for a moment. Fife, which was the chief. And third from the end, on a hook by the door to the watchroom, in letters that had gone the color of old teeth but had not moved 1/1000th of an inch, Prewitt. Verna went and stood in front of that coat and did not touch it for a long time. The helmet above it was leather, black, with a high comb and a long duckbill in back, and on the brass front piece under the shield was a numeral 2 and under that the word driver. There was a pair of gloves in the coat pocket, the fingers curled the way a man's gloves curl when he pulls them off by the fingertips and drops them in. There was a paper sack of horehound candy in the other pocket, which had turned into a single amber stone, and there was a small photograph tucked into the sweatband of the helmet, printed on paper with a scalloped white edge, of a woman in a good coat holding the hand of a girl in a snowsuit on the steps of a church, and the girl was Verna, and the woman was her mother Delia, who had been dead for 31 years, and neither of them had ever known that photograph was there. She sat down on the running board of engine number 2 with the photograph in her hand. Wren came and sat beside her. Ozzie went and looked at the ceiling for a while at the other end of the bay so that they could have the minute, which was, Wren said afterward, the single kindest thing she ever watched a man do. Verna did not cry hard. She was not a woman who cried hard. She sat on the running board of her father's engine in the cold and the dust with the lantern, making everything gold, and she said, out loud, to nobody in that room, they told me you left it a mess. They said you left it a mess and the pump wouldn't take water, and that's why. She looked down the length of the machine at the squared-off couplings and the tied-off ladder and the boots standing side by side on the tail step, and she said, this is a mess. There was one more thing in the bay that night, and they nearly walked past it. because it was on the wall by the watchroom door at the height of a man's face, and it was the color of the wall. It was a slab of black walnut, 3 feet by 2, with a border routed around it, and on it, in gold, were 31 names, and above the names it said Harlow Bend Fire Company Association, organized 1897. And below the names it said, "We hold in trust what we cannot replace." The lantern went brown, and Ozzie said the battery was done, and they came out into a Mercer Street where the street light had come on, and where 2 cars had stopped in the middle of the road because word travels fastest in a town where nothing happens. Verna locked the north door with the flat brass key. She went home to the farmhouse that was not hers anymore, and she sat up in the kitchen until 2 a.m. with the good cups still in the drainer, and she did not sleep at all, and she was not tired. By 9 the next morning, there were 11 people on the sidewalk across from the station. By noon there were 30. Harlow Bend had 409 residents and a cafe that opened at 5:30, and the arithmetic of that town meant that a story could go from the north door of a building to the far end of the county in about 90 minutes, and this story had a running start. Verna did not let anybody in. She stood on the top step of the north door in her cardigan with the key in her fist and told them, kindly, that the floor was 60 years old and the ceiling had plaster on it, and she was not going to be responsible for a broken hip, and that when she knew what she had, they would all know what she had. Ozzie stood at the bottom of the steps with his arms folded and did not have to say anything, because a 71-year-old man who has decided something is a wall. The first car with an out-of-town plate came at 1 o'clock. The first offer came at 2. Grady Rathbone was 48 years old, and he owned the grain elevator at the end of Mercer, and the 2 rental houses on 3rd and the ground under the insurance office, and he had a way of parking his crew cab at an angle so that it took up more of the street than it needed to. He came up the walk with his hand already out and called her Miss Verna, which nobody had ever called her, and he said he'd heard she'd got herself into a situation with that old building, and he'd hate to see her stuck with the abatement on it. He said asbestos. He said liability, which was the second time in a week a person had said that word at her. And then he said he'd take the whole parcel off her hands, as is, where is, no inspection, cash at closing, $18,000, and she could keep whatever knickknacks she wanted out of it. Verna said no thank you. He came back at 4 with $31,000. He said, "That's 4 times what your husband paid for it, and I'll pay the closing costs." And Verna said, "Grady, was your grandfather Emmett Rathbone?" He said, "Yes, ma'am," and there was a small change in his face, no bigger than a shift of weight, and then it was gone and he was smiling again. She said no thank you a second time, and she went inside and locked the north door, and Ozzie told her later that Grady sat in that truck at the curb for 11 minutes before he drove away. Curtis called at 7 that evening. He had heard from Deirdre, who had heard from her sister in Renner, who had seen it on the county page. He wanted to know what she thought she was doing. He wanted to know whether she understood that if somebody got hurt in there, they would come after the farm. And she said, "Curtis, they cannot come after the farm. You own the farm. You made very sure of that." And there was a silence on the line, about 6 seconds long. Then he said, "Well, is it worth anything?" And she said, "I don't know yet." And he said, "When you know, you call me first." Which was, she thought afterward, the most honest sentence her older son had said to her in 10 years. She did not call him first. What she did for the next 9 days was work. Wren took her vacation and then took unpaid leave. Ozzie brought a generator and 2 work lights and a shop vacuum and a nephew named Toby, who was 20 and had a truck. They did not clean the engine because Wren had spent an evening reading and had learned that the worst thing an amateur can do to 60 years of original finish is love it with a rag. They swept the floor. They took the plywood off one apparatus arch from the inside so that daylight came into that bay for the first time since 1965, and the daylight did something to the gold leaf that made Toby, who cared about nothing, say a word his mother would not have liked. And they went through the watchroom. The watchroom was a 12 by 14 box off the front corner of the bay, with a window that had been bricked over, and a coal stove and a roll-top desk, and a wooden armchair with the varnish worn off both arms. On the wall was a board with 31 hooks and a brass tag on each hook, and a card in a frame-headed order of response. In the desk, they found the paper. It came out in an order that made no sense, the way things come out of a desk. Association minute books, 9 of them going back to 1897, in 3 different hands. Subscription lists. Receipts from a hardware store that had been gone since before Verna was born. A cigar box of brass tokens. 2 ledgers of dues. A folder of insurance correspondence, and the run logs. The run logs of the Harlow Bend Fire Company were bound in black canvas with red corners, 1 volume to every 4 or 5 years, and each page was ruled in columns, date, time alarm received, time out of quarters, time on scene, location, nature, apparatus responding, officer in charge, water source, time returned, remarks. Every line was in ink. Every line was signed. There were 41 volumes in that desk and the bottom drawer and the shelf above it, and Verna sat down in the wooden armchair with the varnish worn off the arms and took out the volume that covered 1961 to 1965 and turned to the 3rd of March of 1963. She had to hold the lamp closer. The hand that had written the entry was small and upright and belonged to Otho Lance, who had the watch that night and who had been dead since 1988, and the entry read across the page in 11 columns, as calm as a grocery list. Alarm received by telephone from the night clerk at the Sheldrake Hotel at 2:47 in the morning. Out of quarters, engine number 2 at 2:50. On scene, 3rd and Ottaway at 2:52. Nature, structure, occupied, water source, hydrant at 3rd and Ottaway, and then, in the remarks column, in the same calm hand, 7 words that Verna read 4 times before her ears started to ring. Hydrant dry. Valve closed at main per WW. She sat very still, because she knew, the way everybody her age in that town knew, what the inquiry had said. The inquiry of 1963 had found that the alarm was received at 2:31 and that the apparatus did not reach the scene until 3:04, and that upon arrival the pump failed to take water, and it had used the words delay in response and failure of apparatus. And the town had done the rest. 33 minutes. That was the number Harlow Bend had carried for 63 years. 33 minutes from alarm to arrival, and everybody knew, without ever quite saying it in front of the man's daughter, what a driver had to be doing in the middle of the night to lose 33 minutes. But the log in her hand said 2:47 to 2:52. 5 minutes. 3 minutes from the ring of the telephone to the wheels crossing the sill, in a volunteer house where the men slept in their own beds in their own houses, which anybody who has ever run a volunteer company will tell you is not merely good, it is very nearly impossible. Wren said, "Grandma, what is it?" And Verna said, "It's the wrong time." She said, "The whole town has the wrong time." And then, before Wren could ask what that meant, Verna looked up from the logbook at the corner of the watchroom, where a tall oak case stood on the wall beside the door with a glass front and a brass crank handle on its side, and behind the glass, threaded through a mechanism of little wheels and a punch and an inked ribbon, was a narrow paper tape. And the tape came up out of a box below the case, and the box was full. She did not touch the register that night. She had a feeling about it, the way you have a feeling about a thing you might break. And she left it in its oak case with the glass shut and went back to the logbooks, and it was Wren who said in the morning that they ought to find out how big this was before they found out how important it was. So they measured it. The bay was 62 feet deep, and engine number 2 took up less than half of that, and behind the engine, where the lantern had not reached on the first night, hung a second canvas on a wire, a curtain rather than a cover, and behind the curtain the floor changed from plank to brick, and the ceiling went up into the hose tower. There was a second vehicle back there. It stood on 4 iron-tired wheels, with a long tongue folded up against the front of it in a seat like a church pew. And it was a hose wagon, hand-lettered Harlow Bend Hose Company No. 1, and the date painted in a scroll on the side was 1901, and it was the wagon the association had bought with the subscription money in the same year they laid the brick. It had been drawn by 2 horses until 1928 and by men before that. On its bed were 4 coils of leather riveted hose that predated rubber lining, and a hand lantern with a red globe unbroken, and a set of harness hanging on a peg on the wall behind it, with the collar still stuffed and the brass still on the hames. In the tower above it, 42 lengths of hose hung from the drying rack on their bronze hooks, straight down through 50 feet of dark, and when Toby put the work light on the floor and pointed it up, that tower lit like the inside of a church, and everybody in the building came back to look at it. The stairs went up along the north wall. On the second floor there was a dormitory with 8 iron beds in 2 rows, each made up, each with a gray wool blanket folded in a square at the foot, and a boot pair under every bed, and the round hole with the brass pole coming up through the floor between the rows and a rope guard around it. There was a room with a long oak table and 11 chairs, and a lectern and a coffee urn the size of a milk can, which was where the association had met on the first Monday of every month for 68 years. There was a case with 16 trophies in it from the county hose coupling tournaments 1912 through 1959, and a photograph on the wall of 31 men standing in 3 rows in front of the open apparatus doors on a summer day in 1954, and Verna found her father in the second row, third from the left, with his arms crossed and his chin up, and the beginnings of the way he would look later. And there was a steel file cabinet, 4 drawers, olive green. In the corner of the meeting room, under a window that had been bricked from the outside so that it let in nothing. That cabinet was the reason Verna Sowell stopped being a woman who had found an old fire engine and became a woman who had found something else. The top drawer was association correspondence. The second was equipment records. 1 folder for every piece of apparatus and every length of hose, with dates of purchase, dates of test, dates of repair. The third drawer was hydrants. The fourth drawer was alarms. She started in the hydrant drawer because of the 7 words in the remarks column. Inside it, filed by street and then by year, were the annual flow tests of every hydrant in the town of Harlow Bend. Going back to 1922, written up on printed cards in a dozen different hands. And there, in the folder marked 3rd Street, were 3 carbon copies of a form headed Fire Company report to Town Council, each one filled out in a square, upright hand she had known her whole childhood from the backs of photographs and the fronts of Christmas envelopes. Her father's writing. The first was dated the 9th of January, 1963. It reported that during a routine flow test, the hydrant at 3rd and Ottaway had produced no water, that the waterworks had a valve closed on the main at 3rd and Cherry from the repair made in December, and that the valve had not been reopened. It requested that the council direct the waterworks superintendent to reopen the valve and confirm the flow in writing. Across the bottom of the carbon, stamped in violet ink, were the words received, AND filed, and under that, in a broad, confident hand, the signature, E. Rathbone, Chairman. The second was dated the 4th of February. It said the same thing in shorter words and added that the hydrant had been tagged out of service with a canvas cover and that the two nearest hydrants were 460 feet and 610 feet distant, which is beyond the reach of a pre-connected line and means a lay, and a lay means minutes. Received, A.N.D. filed. E. Rathbone, Chairman. The third was dated the 20th of February, 11 days before the Sheldrake Hotel burned. It was one paragraph long, and the last sentence of it, written by a 51-year-old man who drove a truck and had finished the 10th grade, read as follows. If we are called to the hotel block or to the school with this valve shut, we will not have water, and men and women will be dead of it, and I will not have it said that I did not put this in writing. Received, A.N.D. filed. E. Rathbone, Chairman. Verna had to go sit on one of the iron beds. Wren read the fourth drawer while her grandmother sat there, and the fourth drawer was worse or better, depending on which end of it you were standing at. The town of Harlow Bend had a fire alarm system, the kind with the cast iron boxes on the corner poles that a person pulled a hook down in, and the boxes ran on two circuits, west and east, into the register in the watchroom. In October of 1962, a windstorm had taken down a line on Ottaway Street and put a break in the East Circuit. The East Circuit covered the hotel block, the school, and the 4 blocks of houses behind them. There were 11 pieces of paper in that folder about the East Circuit. 2 of them were bids from the electrical contractor in Renner to repair the break. $418, and then, in January, $390. 6 of them were fire company requests, 4 in Arden Pruitt's hand and 2 in Chief Wendell Fife's, dated October, November, December, January, February, and February again, each one asking the council to authorize the repair, each one stamped, received, A&E filed, and signed by the chairman. And the 11th was a single half sheet of council stationery dated the 11th of January, 1963, which said, in typewriting, that at the regular meeting, the motion to authorize repair of the East Alarm Circuit was put and failed for want of a second, and that the clerk was directed to advise the fire company that in the judgment of the council, the telephone was sufficient. The telephone was sufficient. Verna sat on the iron bed in the cold with that half sheet in her hand and did the arithmetic that the town of Harlow Bend had refused to do for 63 years. A man at a corner box at 2:30 in the morning pulls the hook down and hears the mechanism run and believes, because why would he not, that somewhere a bell has rung. Nothing rings. Nothing rings for 16 minutes while he stands there in the street in his shirt sleeves and the fire gets into the stairwell until a night clerk with the presence of mind of an angel runs across 3rd Street and beats on a door and gets to a telephone. 2:47, and then 3 minutes to roll and 2 minutes on the road. And then a driver swings his engine to a hydrant that he has told them in writing 3 times is dead and finds it dead and has to lay 460 feet of hose up 3rd Street by hand in the dark while a hotel burns behind him with 4 people in it. That was the delay in response. That was the failure of apparatus. Wren said, very quietly, Grandma, this was in a drawer. And Verna said, no, this was in a building they bricked up. It was Wren who wrote the letters, because Wren was 26 and had grown up believing that if you needed an expert, you simply went and found one. She wrote to the State Fire Service Museum in Des Moines. She wrote to the County Historical Society in Renner. She wrote to a national registry of surviving fire apparatus that she found after 2 hours of searching, and she attached 11 photographs and 1 paragraph of description, and she did not expect an answer for a month. The registry answered in 51 minutes. The man who came was named Merritt Vandal. He was 58. He had a gray beard trimmed close and rimless glasses and a canvas satchel. and he had spent 30 years appraising and cataloging American fire apparatus for museums and insurers and estates, and he drove 410 miles from Ohio in one day and arrived at 7 in the morning and would not go to the cafe first. Verna let him in the north door. He came down the short passage with the coat rail on the wall, and he stepped out into the bay, where the daylight was now coming through the one-opened arch and falling along 24 feet of dark red paint and gold leaf, and he stopped so completely that Ozzie put a hand out in case he went over. Merritt Vandal did not say anything for a minute and a half. Verna timed it later against the clock in the watchroom because she wanted to be able to tell it right. Then he set his satchel on the floor without looking where he was setting it, and he said, in a voice that had gone thin at the edges, "Ma'am, do you know what this is?" She said, "It's my father's engine." He said, "It's a Corbin Hale piston pumper, and they built 406 of them, and I have personally inspected every one that is known to exist, and there are 9. He walked the length of it slowly, with his hand not quite touching. Of the 9, he said, 6 are shells. 2 are restored, which in this business means somebody took a wire wheel to them in 1980 and painted them with a spray gun. 1, until 11 minutes ago, was the best original example in the country, and it is in a museum in Pennsylvania, and it has replacement wheels and a reproduction bell and no hose. He got to the tailboard and he looked at the loaded hose bed and the boots standing on the tail step with the tops folded down, and he took his glasses off and pressed the corner of his eye with his thumb. He said, "This one has its hose." He said, "This one has its house." 2 days he spent in there. He measured and photographed and crawled underneath on a creeper Toby borrowed and pulled the pump packing and looked at it and put it back. He found the original bill of sale in the second drawer of the olive green cabinet made out to the Harlow Bend Fire Company Association. $7,400, 1928, paid in 3 installments. He found the maintenance card for the pump with a test entry every spring in the same square upright hand, the last one dated the 4th of April, 1963, 5 weeks after the Sheldrake fire, with the notation, "Pump drawn and tested at capacity, 750 gallons, no defect found." And a signature. He found the hose wagon behind the canvas curtain and had to sit down on the church pew seat of it for a while. And on the second afternoon, with Verna and Wren and Ozzie and Toby and Maribel Quist from the recorder's office standing in the bay because Maribel had taken a personal day for this, Merritt Vandal put his notebook down on the running board and said the number out loud. He said, "I want to be careful because there are 2 numbers. He said the apparatus alone, sold at auction to the collector market, in this condition, with this provenance, I would expect $385,000 to $420,000, and I would not be shocked by more, because there are 4 men in this country who would fight over it." He said, "The hose wagon of 1901, complete with harness, is another 55 to 70. He said the alarm register, the tower rack, the coats, the helmets, the trophy case, the association archive going back to 1897, taken as pieces, is another 100 and change." And then he said, "But that is the wrong number, and I would ask you not to use it." He put his hand flat on the running board the way Curtis had put his hand flat on a piece of paper, but it was not the same gesture at all. He said, "What you have here is not an engine. It is a complete American volunteer fire company, sealed in place, in its own purpose-built house, with its apparatus, its equipment, its personal gear on the hooks with the men's names on it, and its entire paper record from the year it organized to the day it stopped." He said, "I know of nothing like it." He said, "As an intact assemblage, in place, I would put $640,000 on the contents for insurance purposes tomorrow morning, and I would tell you that the insurance number is a fiction, because you cannot replace it, and there is nowhere to buy another one. Marable Quist said, out loud, "Sweet Lord in heaven," and had to go sit in the watchroom. Ozzie Crawl stood with his cap in his hands like he was at a graveside, and Verna Sowell, who had paid $3,450 and some cents in a county treasurer's office 11 days earlier because her sons did not want the bill, looked at the black walnut plaque on the wall with 31 gold names on it and read the line under them again. We hold in trust what we cannot replace. The county assessor came the following week. Orville Tinsley had carried the Renner County rolls for 19 years, and he had the parcel on his card at $9,200, land and improvements, condemned adjacent, and he walked through that building for 2 hours with his hat pushed back and then stood on the sidewalk and told Verna plainly that he did not have a category for this and that he was going to have to call the state. And the last one to come was the one that mattered. Hollis Brame was 79 years old and lived in Rock Island, and had spent his working life maintaining municipal fire alarm circuits and registers for 4 cities, and Wren found him through a collector's forum. And he came on a Sunday with a wooden box of tools and a pair of magnifying spectacles. He worked on the oak case in the watchroom for 6 hours. He would not let anyone hurry him. He said the tape was paper, and paper that has been dry and dark for 60 years is stronger than people think and weaker than they hope. At 3 p.m, he had the case open and the mechanism free and the tape drawn out of the box below in one continuous ribbon, and he laid it along the floor of the apparatus bay, weighted at intervals with washers, all the way from the watchroom door to the tail step of engine number 2, and he got down on his knees at the far end with his spectacles on and began to read the punches. Out loud, like a man reading scripture. A register tape is a narrow ribbon of paper with a row of small punched marks running down it, and to anybody who has not spent 40 years with the machines, it is a strip of nothing. Hollis Brame read it like a page. He explained as he went for the benefit of the 8 people sitting on the floor of that apparatus bay, that the register punched a mark for every signal it received, and a mark of a different kind at the top of every hour, to say that each circuit was whole and quiet, and that when a circuit was broken, the hourly mark changed shape, and that was the trouble mark, and a trouble mark repeated hour after hour after hour meant a deadline and a station that knew it. He began at the 28th of October, 1962. West Circuit, normal. East Circuit, normal. Then the 29th of October, at 4 p.m, in the middle of the storm that took the line down on Ottaway Street, the East Circuit went to trouble, and it never came back. Hollis Brame crawled along that tape on his knees for 4 hours, reading hours out loud. And every hour of it, through November and December and January and February, was the same mark. He said at one point that he had never in his life seen a municipality run a dead circuit for 126 days. And Ozzie said, "We didn't run it. We saved $400 on it." And nobody laughed. At the 3rd of March, 1963, Hollis stopped and put his finger down and asked for quiet. He said, "Here is your night." At 2 a.m, hourly mark, West Circuit whole, East Circuit trouble. At 2:31 in the morning, nothing at all, he said, and I want everybody here to understand what that means, because it is the whole business. It does not mean nobody pulled a box. It means a box on the east side could be pulled by a man hanging his whole weight on it, and this machine would never know, and no gong in this house would ring, and the men asleep in their beds on the west side of town would sleep on. At 2:47, still nothing on the tape, because a telephone call to the watch desk is not a signal and does not punch. But at 2:59, Hollis said, and his voice went up half a note, at 2:59 somebody pulled box number 9 at 4th and Main, West Circuit, and the register took it clean, 4 rounds, no fault, the punch as crisp as the day the machine was made. He sat back on his heels. He said, that is the chief sending a man 3 blocks to call out more manpower. And that one signal proves this register was in perfect order that night, and its clock was running, and its ribbon was inked, and its paper was feeding. Everything that could reach this machine reached it. The East Side could not reach it because your counsel would not spend $390. And then, because he was 79 and did not have to be delicate anymore. Hollis Bream looked up at Verna Sowell sitting on the running board in her cardigan and said, "Ma'am, this tape is the only thing in this town that kept honest minutes, and it has been in that box waiting for somebody to ask it." There was one more piece of paper, and Maribel Quist found it in the top drawer in the association correspondence in a folder marked simply Inquiry. It was a carbon of a letter from Chief Wendell Fife to the Town Council of Harlow Bend, dated the 22nd of March, 1963, 2 days after the findings were adopted. It ran 3 pages. It set out the times from the run log. It set out the dead hydrant and the 3 written reports about it. It set out the dead alarm circuit and the 11 pieces of paper about that. It stated that the time of alarm used by the inquiry, 2:31, was the time a hotel guest testified he pulled a box on a circuit the council knew to be out of service, and that to call at the time the alarm was received by the fire company was to charge his men with 16 minutes that belonged to somebody else. And it closed by saying that the chief would resign rather than sign findings that used the phrase failure of apparatus about a pump he had personally tested. Stamped across the bottom in violet ink were the words received, A.N.D. filed, and under them, E. Rathbone, Chairman. There was no reply in the folder. There was no reply because there had not been one. Chief Fife resigned in June, and the association stopped meeting in August, and in the spring of 1965 a mason was paid $112 to fill the apparatus arches with block, and the reason for that expense in the town's own ledger, which Maribel dug out of the courthouse basement, was recorded as securing the property. Grady Rathbone came back on a Thursday evening. He did not park at an angle. He came up the walk without his hand out, and he had a cardboard box under his arm, and his face was the face of a man who has not slept in 3 nights, and he said, "Verna, can I come in?" And she said yes. The box held his grandfather's personal papers. Emmett Rathbone had died in 1991, and the box had been in Grady's mother's attic, and then in Grady's. Unopened for 35 years, and Grady had gone up after it the night she told him no, the second time, because, he said, when I was 19 years old, my grandfather told me that if I ever got the chance, I should see that building came down, and I never thought about it again until you opened it. Inside the box was a black cloth bound minute book kept in a private hand. That ran alongside the official one, and in the official minute book of the town of Harlow Bend, which anybody could read at the courthouse any day of the week, the meeting of the 18th of March, 1963, showed the adoption of the findings. In the private one, in Emmett Rathbone's own writing, the same meeting showed a motion, made and seconded, that the findings be worded so as not to name personnel, and beneath it a single line added later in a smaller and less confident version of the same hand. It read, "The circuit is on us, and we cannot say so now. God forgive us, it will fall on the driver, and he is a good man." Grady Rathbone read that line out loud in the watchroom of the fire station his family had bricked shut, and then he put the book down on the desk and stood there with his hands at his sides. He said, "I withdraw my offer." He said, "I don't want this building." He said, "What do you want? And I will pay for it, and I don't want my name on it. Verna Sewell thought about it overnight. She did not want a lawsuit because everybody she could have sued had been dead for 30 years, and she did not want a story in the paper first, because a story in the paper is a thing that happens to a town and not a thing a town does. What she wanted was older and simpler than either. She wanted the doors open. She wanted the block out of the arches and the doors standing open on Mercer Street with the sun coming into that bay, and the whole town standing in the street, and the record read out loud in front of everybody who had ever looked away from her in the grocery. And she wanted one more thing, which she did not tell anybody for 2 weeks because she was afraid it could not be had. She wanted the engine to run. Merritt Vandal said it was possible. He said it in the careful way of a man who does not like to promise, but he said it. A piston pumper of that generation is a simple animal, a 6-cylinder engine, a magneto, a gravity fuel tank, a pump driven off the crankshaft through a gearbox, and no electronics anywhere on it to have died of boredom. The machine had been drained, oiled, and put away by a man who did that job the way other men pray. It had sat in a dry, dark building at an even temperature for 61 years. Vandal brought 2 restorers from the State Museum, and they worked 11 days. They jacked the wheels off the floor and let the tires stand a week to take the flat spots down. They drained the 61-year-old varnish out of the fuel line and the tank and cleaned the carburetor and put in fresh fuel. They pulled the plugs and put a spoonful of oil down each cylinder and turned the engine over by hand with the crank all the way around twice, and Merritt Vandal said afterward that when it came around freely with no drag, he had to go outside. They put in new plugs and points and a new fan belt and left everything else alone, and on the 9th day they rolled it out into the alley behind the station on a tow rope and let the clutch out at 7 miles an hour, and the engine caught on the 3rd compression and ran. Ozzie Krall, who had heard that engine at the age of 9, sat down on the alley pavement. The mason took the block out of both apparatus arches on a Wednesday, and behind the block, protected from 61 years of weather by the very thing that had imprisoned them, stood the original apparatus doors, 4 leaves of quarter-sawn oak with cast-iron hinges and glass in the upper panels, sound and whole and needing nothing but a wipe. The Saturday was the 6th of June, and the sun came up on a town that had not been that full since the centennial. They counted 340 people on Mercer Street. The county paper sent a photographer, and a television crew came from Cedar Rapids and parked at the co-op and stayed all day. The cafe opened at 5:30 and ran out of everything by 9 and sent to Renner for more. Verna Sewell wore the oatmeal cardigan, because Wren asked her to, and stood on the top step of the north door at 10 in the morning while Ozzie and Toby folded the 4 oak leaves back against the brick, and the light went into that bay all the way to the back wall and hit the gold leaf on engine number 2, and 340 people made a sound that Wren said afterward was not a cheer. And not a gasp, but something in between that she had never heard a group of people make before. Mayor Laura Lee Dunphy spoke for 2 minutes and had the sense to stop. Then Verna took the microphone, and she did not tell the story, because she had decided that the story should not come out of the mouth of the man's daughter. Instead, she called the record. Wren read the run log entry for the 3rd of March, 1963, straight across the 11 columns. In a clear voice, alarm received 247 out of quarters 250. On scene 252, hydrant dry, valve closed at main. Hollis Bream stood on a chair with the register tape on a spool and read the hours of the East Circuit from October to March. And then read the silence at 2:31, and then read box number 9 at 2:59, 4 rounds clean. Maribel Quist read the 3 hydrant reports in Arden Pruitt's own words, and when she got to the last sentence of the 3rd one, the one about men and women being dead of it, and I will not have it said that I did not put this in writing. There was a sound out in the street that was people not knowing where to look. Merritt Vandal read the pump test card, 5 weeks after the fire, pump drawn and tested at capacity. 750 gallons, no defect found. And then Grady Rathbone, who owned the elevator and the rental houses and the ground under the insurance office, and who had not slept properly in 7 weeks, climbed up on the tailboard of the engine with his grandfather's private minute book and read the motion that the findings be worded so as not to name personnel, and then read the line underneath it, and then said, "That is my grandfather's handwriting, and that is my family's doing, and I am not going to stand here and pretend it isn't." The mayor read the resolution after that. It rescinded the findings of the 18th of March, 1963 in their entirety. It entered into the permanent record of the town of Harlow Bend that the delay of 16 minutes on the night of the Sheldrake Hotel fire was caused by the failure of the East Alarm Circuit, which the council of that year had voted 3 times not to repair, and that the failure to obtain water was caused by a closed valve on the main that the fire company had reported in writing on 3 occasions, and that no fault whatsoever attached to the officers or the driver of engine number 2. It was carried 5-0, and then an old woman in a blue coat stood up from a folding chair in the second row with the help of her son's arm and asked whether she might say something. Corinne Vasek was 81 years old, and her mother had died on the 3rd floor of the Sheldrake Hotel when Corinne was 18. She said she had been told her whole life that a man had been slow. She said she had believed it and had said it and had raised her children on it, and there was a man in this town she had crossed the street to avoid for 8 years before he died, and she had thought she was owed that. She said, "I would like to say his name out loud in this street, and I would like his daughter to hear me say it." She said, "Arden Pruitt." She said it twice. Verna Sowell got the folding chair beside her before her knees went, and Wren was on the other side, and the 2 old women sat and held on to each other's hands in the middle of Mercer Street, while 340 people stood there and let them. They pumped at 1 o'clock. A tanker from the county fire district parked at the curb and put a hard suction into its tank, and the men from the State Museum walked Verna up onto the running board, and Merritt Vandal put her hand on the brass bell lanyard. Engine number 2 came out of its own house under its own power for the first time since the spring of 1965 and stood in the middle of Mercer Street with its gold leaf blazing, and the pump was put in gear, and the needles on the white faces of those gauges came up off their pins and swung around and stood where they were supposed to stand. 2 lines were charged. A stream went up over the roof line of the grain elevator at the end of the street, 70 feet of solid water in the sunshine, and it hung there, and the spray came down over the crowd, and the whole town of Harlow Bend, Iowa, stood in the road in June and got wet on purpose. Verna rang the bell. She rang it the way her father had rung it, 6 strokes and a pause and 6 more. And when she came down off the running board, Ozzie Krall was standing there with his cap in his hands again, and he said, "Miss Verna, there is not one thing wrong with that apparatus." And she said, "No, Ozzie, there never was." The offers came all summer. A collector in Michigan wired an offer of $460,000 for engine number 2 alone, sight unseen. Transport at his expense, and when Verna said no, he raised it and then flew into Cedar Rapids to say it to her face, and she gave him coffee in the watchroom and said no there instead. She did not sell the engine. She did not sell any of it. What she signed in September, after 4 months of lawyers Wren found and Grady Rathbone quietly paid for, was an agreement with the State Historical Foundation and the Fire Service Museum that placed the entire assemblage under permanent conservation covenant in that building, in that town, in exchange for $240,000 paid to Verna Sowell. A maintenance endowment for the roof and the tower, and a clause she insisted on and would not trade for money, which was that the interpretive plaque at the apparatus doors must carry the full record of the 3rd of March, 1963, in the words of the rescinding resolution, and must name the driver. Orville Tinsley put the parcel back on the county rolls at $318,000, and then, when the covenant took effect at exempt, and he told Verna it was the only card he had ever been glad to change twice. Curtis called in July. He had a lawyer with him on the line, which is a thing a man does when he already suspects the answer. The lawyer was courteous and said the word ambiguity 3 times, and then he asked Curtis to read the quitclaim aloud, and Curtis read it and got to the phrase together with all improvements, fixtures, appurtenances, and chattels situated thereon, and stopped. The lawyer explained what a chattel was. He explained that a fire engine sitting on a floor inside a building is about as pure an example of a chattel as the law has ever produced, and that the two of them had signed away, for value received, any interest they held or might come to hold in every last item in that building in front of a notary on the same morning they took a farmhouse and 80 acres and a lot on the highway. He asked whether they had read it. Curtis said it was the piece we were giving away. Verna heard the whole thing and did not say anything at all because there was nothing in it that needed her. Neil came around first. He drove up on a Sunday in August with his sleeves rolled and a cooler of pop in the back and asked what needed carrying, and there was a great deal that needed carrying. And he carried it for 9 hours and did not once mention money, and at the end of it he stood in the bay looking at the coat with Prewitt stenciled across the shoulders and said, "Ma, I didn't know any of this. I only ever knew the part everybody knew." And she said, "I know. That was all either of them ever said about it, and it was enough," and he came back the next Sunday and the one after that. Curtis took until Christmas. He came to the door of the 2nd floor with a poinsettia and the expression of a man carrying a heavy chair up a narrow stair, and he said, "I should have read it," and she said, "You should have read a lot of things, Curtis," and let him stand there for exactly as long as it took him to understand that she was not going to help him. And then she stood aside and said, "There is a box of hymnals on the landing that has to go up to the meeting room," and he took his coat off. It is not a made-up ending. He is still the man who put his hand flat on the paper. But he comes at Christmas and he comes in June, and in June he stands in the street with everybody else. She never moved to Fairview Court. The 2nd floor of the fire station had a dormitory, a meeting room, a bathroom with a clawfoot tub, and a stove flue. And by November, it had a kitchen, a bedroom in the west end with a window that had not been bricked, a chair lift on the stair rail, and a 74-year-old woman living in it who woke every morning above her father's engine. Wren moved to Harlow Bend the following spring and runs the place, which is open Saturdays from 10 to 4 and by appointment, and had 11,000 visitors in its first full year in a town of 409. The cafe opens Saturdays now. The insurance office next door became a bakery. The county fire district put its northern crew in the back half of the lot and asked permission before painting anything, and the name on their 2 engines, by vote of the district board, is Harlow Bend Fire Company. Ozzie Krall is the head docent and wears a company shirt and tells the story to strangers 4 times an hour and has never once got through the part about the boots on the tail step without stopping. The plaque went up on the brick between the 2 arches, brass on granite the summer after. It carries the full record. It carries the times, the dead circuit, the closed valve, the 3 votes, and the rescinding resolution word for word, and at the bottom, in letters larger than the rest, it says engine number 2. Driver Arden Prewitt, 1941 to 1963. He put it in writing. on Saturday mornings at 10 o'clock. When the oak doors are folded back and the light comes into the bay all the way to the black walnut plaque with the 31 gold names on it, Verna Sowell walks out onto the sidewalk in her oatmeal cardigan and pulls the rope in the tower and rings the bell 6 strokes, a pause, and 6 more. Her sons took the farmhouse and the 80 acres and the lot on the highway. And they were welcome to them. She took the parcel nobody wanted and paid the bill on it herself, and what the deed included was a fire engine, a hose wagon of 1901, 31 coats on their hooks, 129 years of a town's own paper, and 16 minutes that had been sitting in a sealed room for 61 years waiting for somebody to open the door and ask.